Alright, we're putting new brakes on the Rio today. This is going to cover 2012 to 2017 in North America. Should be very similar for previous and future generations, but we're going to do both the front and rear set of pads and rotors. And being an Amazon associate, if these are available on Amazon, I will put a link in the description to the parts used in this video. So let's start on the front and then we'll move to the rear. So to start, before we get in the air, we're going to want to loosen each one of these lug nuts a half turn. Once it's up securely on a jack stand, not the jack, then you can finish removing your lug nuts, take the wheel off. A lot of times they'll stick. Yep, this one's stuck. So you can take a little mallet, not a regular hammer. I mean, if that's all you got, it might work. Block of wood all around the rim. I'm probably going to try to find something a little smaller than this. However, if you go too small like this, usually they'll break. And just kind of tap around the rim of the wheel, front and back, until it pops free. In extreme cases, and I do not recommend it because it's not safe doing it on the driveway like this with a jack stand. I've had to get under them and kick them off before, but do not recommend that whatsoever. Just take your time with a wooden block, work at it front and back with a mini sledge and a block of wood until it pops free. And if it really gives you trouble, you can try spraying around here and around these lugs here with some PB Blaster a few times over the course of an hour or so, and it might help loosen it. Alright, once you got the wheel off, you want to take off your caliper here. If you're just doing pads, all you'll need to do is take off this caliper. But if you're doing the rotor, you're going to have to take off both. But it's a lot easier to swap the pads out if you take them apart separately, the caliper from the caliper bracket. So to detach the caliper, we're going to take two bolts off, one here, one down there that matches. For me, it's a 14 millimeter. There are those. And then you're going to want to use a large flathead screwdriver or something similar. And you can see it move there. Go back and forth, top to bottom. Pry your caliper off. And we don't want to let this hang from the rubber brake hose, or you can damage this internally and then your brakes will stick, and that's no good. So you're going to have something up in here when you slide this off to set it up on, so the weight of it's not hanging off this rubber brake hose there. Like so. Then you can slide your pads out, and especially if you're doing this for the first time, pay close attention to how all this hardware goes, especially for replacement and the orientation of the pads. But they will pretty much, you might take two hands here, it's hard to do while recording, but they'll just slide out like so, both the front and rear. Okay, like so. And these are in pretty good shape, but we are having issues with the rear, so we're just going ahead and doing all four as a kit. And I'll just show you while I have these old ones off here. So this is the one that came off the front, and this is the one that came off the rear. There's a slight difference, and that is that guy there. So a lot of kits, they'll come, I call this the squealer, because when your brakes get low and need replaced, that little metal tang will hit your rotor and it'll produce a squealing sound. So usually when you hear people, their brakes are squealing, that's why, and they need replaced. But some kits will come, will have a squealer on every single pad, but for kits that do not, you only get one squealer. You want to put that on the rear, because that's where your piston is on the caliper here, so that's where the most force is applied. So the rear will always wear out a little faster than the front, which is why if you only have one squealer per side, put it on the rear of the rotor, that is. So now we're ready to take the caliper bracket off. You can just have two bolts on that as well. For me, it's a 17 millimeter, so they're larger and they're going to be tighter. Then with your bracket bolts removed here, don't lose the washers. It'll slide right off. And I just moved this temporarily. You got to be real careful not to knock this guy off. Can't tell you how many times I've done that. Then your bracket will slide off. Again, pay attention to the orientation of how it comes off, and it's also a good time to study your hardware there, how that installs. So to remove the rotor on this model vehicle, you have to take these screws out here. They actually bolt the rotor to the hub. So in most cars I've worked on, they'll just either come right off, or if it's seized up again, you'll have to tap around with your mini sledge here and it'll break free. But these ones actually screwed on there. Sometimes you'll see these, it's usually just one though, and it actually doesn't hold it to the hub, but it's to help you get it off, you can unscrew it, back it out, and then if you run the same thread bolt into that hole, it'll help push the rotor off for you. But in this instance, these are actually bolting the rotor to the hub, so we have to get these out. Now, I could almost guarantee you're not going to be able to get those out with a regular screwdriver unless somebody put them on very loosely. You might be able to get them with a a regular electric screw gun if you press really hard and have the right size bit. But ideally, what you want to use is an impact hammer like this. So you put it on there, you tap the back of it, and it breaks it free for you without stripping out the head. So that's what I'm going to use. I'll put a link in the description to this kit here. Maybe not this exact one. It depends on what's available nowadays compared to when I bought this, but these don't run too much, like 15, 20 bucks, something like that. Put a link in the description to that. Also have links in the description to some of the tools I use, like jack stands and jack and whatnot. But anyways, I got to hit this with that impact screwdriver now to get it out. I got to eat my words here. Look at this. I was just seeing which bit I need, and this one is just finger tight. This one is not. So again, it depends on how hard they put them on. And you can see whoever did this, they put some anti-seize on here and stuff to try to keep things from seizing up. I mean, it still didn't help us get our wheel off because it was all seized up on this. So if it looks like somebody took care of it, it might not actually be that bad. I might need the impact for this, but that one anyways was just hand tight. Let me see if I can just get this one without even hitting this guy here. But like I said, most of the times they're going to be pretty tight and you're going to want to use the impact. Pretty loose. I got lucky. I didn't need the impact screwdriver here, but still linked in the description if you need one. So now this will be free, other than again being seized up, but maybe, yep, that's loose. I already hit it a few times with a hammer before I realized it was screwed into the hub, so that may have helped. But once you get those out, it'll come free of the hub, but you may need to beat around on it some to break it free. But installation of the new parts is pretty much reverse of removal. Although with these new rotors, I am going to have to use some brake parts cleaner and get this sticky coating off of them. That's on both sides. So sometimes when you get your rotors, they'll be coated with this stuff, and it's to keep them from rusting while in storage. Other times, if they're like zinc plated or something, they might not be. So just give them a touch, and if they feel oily, sticky, tacky, anything like that, you're going to have to use brake parts cleaner to clean off both sides, which I need to do. But don't get dirty fingers on the new rotors, new pads, anything like that. Grab everything from the edge, don't touch the mating surfaces. But this is basically going to go back on reverse or removal, but I'll go over that real quick, and then I'll throw up some torque specs for you guys, probably for those who would want it. There's the new rotor, and just kind of hand tighten those screws for next time. There's with the new hardware installed on the bracket, top and bottom. There's a look at how it goes. They just kind of snap and clip into place. So you want to lubricate these lightly with some grease, both ends. That way when your pad's in there, it's going to slide back and forth freely and not stick on you. If your kit does not come with it, most auto parts store, it also depends on where you're buying it from too, but most auto parts store have the little grease kits. They're like 99 cents to $2 for the brakes parts grease there. So you want to lube those, and I'm going to pop this out and show you too. Your slider pins up in here. There's a pin, a rod that runs through this, so you can pop that out. Be careful not to tear that little rubber boot. I'm going to pull that out here and show you. So there's that pulled out there. So these slide as you press and release your brakes down inside of there, and the rubber boot tends to stick to the bolt, so you just carefully pry it off without tearing your boot. But you want to give those a good grease job as well, top and bottom. And it should go without saying, but don't get so much grease on these components to where you're going to worry about it flinging off onto your rotors or pads or anything like that, or you're going to have a problem. You just lightly grease everything that's exposed, like these brackets here. But for the internal part here, you can put a little more inside of there, but again, you don't want to put too much in, or it can squirt out past that boot there. Last thing you want is for any of that grease to get on your pads or rotor. Maybe easier or harder for you to start the pads before you put the bracket back on, or maybe easier for you after it's on. Personally, I like to do it this way because it's a little easier. I don't have to like stick my head back in here to see what's going on to get that back pad in. But you can only barely install them. You got to leave enough room for them to clear the rotor, and they want to keep jumping out on you and shooting out on you. So that's why it may be easier, it may be harder, it just depends. But you got to get enough clearance in there so they'll slide over the rotor, and if you barely bump them, they're going to shoot out on you. So for some people, it might be easier to get this on first and then put the pads on. Then with the caliper bracket bolted back on, give your pads a good squeeze, top and bottom, make sure they're slid in all the way against your rotor there. So now whether you replace just pads or just the rotor or both, your newer ones are going to be thicker because they're not wore down. So now you have to press this piston down in your caliper here so that there's room for it to slide over the new components. So to do that, you'll want to take one of the old pads, because this is hollow in the center. Put it on there so you have a platform to push on. In a pinch, I've done this with very large channel locks before, where I've been able to squeeze the piston back in, but that usually does not work. What you're going to want to use is a C-clamp here like this to press that piston back in. So you get it set up like that, and then crank the handle, press in the piston. Unfortunately, the brake hose bolt here is right dead center where I need this to be, and it keeps wanting to slip off the nut. Plus you could risk rounding the edge of that, so I'm probably going to have to put something metal, or metal block of wood, something like that in between there so I can get this compressed all the way. And there's with the piston fully compressed, it's basically going to be just about flush with the edge there, so now it should fit over the new rotor and pads. Now there's the caliper reinstalled, and if you want, I don't know if you can see the copper particulates down in there, but you can put some, again, a very, very light coating of grease. You don't want it to fly off on your rotor. Where these fingers here and your piston on the back will touch the pads. That way they don't rust, corrode, and seize together when you got to take it off the next time. Usually not a problem anyways, but if you feel so inclined, you can grease the back of the pads there for that reason. Now there's a process you should follow. Get your wheel back on here, getting it torqued back in on properly. That way you don't have warped rotor symptom. A lot of people don't know it, but that's actually how you get a warped rotor, from your wheel not being installed correctly and flush. But I'm going to throw that in at the end of the video, as well as some proper instructions for getting these brakes back and working correctly, because right now everything's pushed back out. But I'm going to save that for the end of the video, so since that's kind of end of the job stuff, go ahead and move on to the rear, show the rear real quick, and then I'll get right on that for you guys for the proper wheel installation and torque, and then also what you want to do with the brakes before you just get in it and go after a brake job. So the rear is extremely similar. It's just going to be slightly scaled down. Your caliper's a little smaller, rotor's a little smaller. Probably have different size bolts. Torque specs might be a little different. We'll go ahead and pop this wheel off and get through the rear real quick. Okay, so here's what you're looking at the rear. There's your rear caliper and then your bracket. So we got, at least for me, they're 14 millimeter for not only the caliper bolts, but also the caliper bracket bolts. So just like on the front end, we're going to take the caliper off first, and then the caliper bracket. Okay, so we got our caliper off here. You have to make sure the e-brake is released or it will not come off. And this is going to kind of dangle here from both of those lines. Caliper bracket's off, and our rotor's loose, and for some reason on the rear you only have one screw, but that one screw is still holding it on. And I did have to use my impact screwdriver for the rear here, and it's actually still pretty stiff. I'm having to continue to use it to keep walking it out because it's being stiff all the way out. Again, if you need one of those, link in the description. Alright, so slip the new rotor on just as the front, clean off front and rear sides of the rotor, hand tighten that screw back on. We got our new hardware installed here. We got the grease compound on there, discussed on the front, got the pads slid in. I'm going to apply some to the back of these pads like discussed on the front. Slip the caliper back over. Now remember, in the front we had to use this C-clamp to push those pistons back in to make clearance for the new pads, new rotor being thicker. On the rear, you have to twist it in. So you're going to want to use some large vice grips like this, or some large channel locks will work. I've used both methods. The trick is to keep this rubber boot here pushed down and not tear it. If you tear it, you will eventually let water and moisture get in there, and it'll seize up your caliper. So you got to turn this back in without tearing this boot, and you want to turn it clockwise to screw it back in. It depends on how low your pads are when you're doing this. Mine weren't too low. I didn't have to screw it in very far, but on this one you're not going to have to go quite flush to get it to fit over there. So basically just get it down as far as you can without ripping that boot, and just keep checking it periodically to see if you have enough clearance to slide over the pads and rotor there. And again, like with the front, you want to apply that grease if you're going to do so to keep everything slick and moving freely. And then also don't forget about the little pins here. You can pull out and grease those up if they're dry as well without tearing the boot. Make sure you got everything tightened up. You're ready to throw the wheel back on. I'll go over that installation slash torque sequence pattern I was discussing earlier with getting that wheel back on nice and flush. That way you don't get the warped rotor symptom. All right, so the way you want to do this, whether it's a 4 lug like this, 5, 6, doesn't matter. You want to go in a crisscross pattern, so you never want to go one to the next like in a circular fashion. You always want to crisscross it. So like go top left, bottom right, top right, bottom left. For example, on a 5 spoke, 5 lug, you just do kind of like a crisscross star pattern, but that'll walk the wheel on nice and straight. If you just blast them on with an impact, or just tighten them all the way down one at a time, or tighten them down in a circular fashion, a lot of times the wheel won't actually go on straight. It'll be tightened down, but it will be microscopically like offset. So that's why you want to do the crisscross pattern. And then I also do it in stages. Like say if your final torque spec is 90 foot-pounds, whether you're going to use a torque wrench or not, I basically go in 3 stages, follow the crisscross pattern. You know, lightly snug them down the first time around, then give them a little more tighter the second time around, and then the third and final time around, go as tight as you're going to go in the crisscross pattern. That helps ensure that you get that wheel on there nice and straight, so you don't get the warped rotor symptom, because if it goes on slightly crooked, then your rotor actually wobbles with the wheel. So over time you'll start to notice that thump sound and feeling in the pedal from that warped rotor, when it's not actually the rotor that's warped, it's because the wheel went on crooked. And by the way, while doing that, you get it as tight as you can while it's up in the air. If you have an automatic, so you can't lock it in gear and you can't pull the e-brake to lock the rear to fully tighten it while it's in the air like I did, you basically just get it as tight as you can while it's up in the air, and then lower the car just enough to put the bare minimum amount of weight on the tire, so that it doesn't spin, so that you can do your other sequences of getting tighter and tighter before you drop the full weight of the car on it. But as for what I was talking about before you go and take off, so your pads, they are not in contact with the rotor, because you depress the piston all the way in the caliper so that you would have clearance to slide it over. So whether it be by, you know, microscopically or a few millimeters, your pads are not actually in contact with the rotor there. So when you very first go to hit the brake, it's gonna go to the floor, especially if you did all 4 corners at the same time like I did, because you have that gap. So what you want to do is get in, start the car, and very lightly, I would say no more than like half to 3/4 of the way down, probably about this fast. Watch my foot, if I can get a freaking focus. You want to go like this, up and down, nice and slow and calmly like that several times, half to 3/4 of the way down, until your pedal firms back up, and then you're good to go. If you don't do that, some cars, if you just go and stomp on it like that, and it goes clear of the floor, like I said it would if you don't bring those pads back flush with the rotors, some cars, it can lock out part of the braking system, whether it be the front or the rear, because when you do that and nothing happens, it thinks that you have a brake line blowout, and so it might lock out the front or rear brakes. So that's why you want to take your time, nice and slow, half to 3/4 of the way down until your pedal firms back up, so you don't have to worry about that. But that's it. If this video helped you out, be sure to leave me a thumbs up. Like I said, link in the description of the tools I use, the ones that I can link to, that is. And then also there should be a link in the description to the brakes for the front and rear if you want to get yourself a set and get this done. Thanks for watching, and I hope to catch you on the next one.